Everybody, welcome to another video today. My name is Chris, and today we're going to be going over all of the Big Lots locations that will be closing, as a lot of these locations are up for lease. So right now they are up for lease. All offers are due no later than January 24th of 2025. So these are all of the Big Lots locations that are up for lease and that are basically going to be liquidating as of this date. So this is the Big Lots closing list as of January 15th of 2024. I'm sorry, Wednesday, January 15th, 2025. Now, again, if I do not list the location that's nearby you, or if you happen to work at that location, that does mean that your location is a going forward location with the new owners. So, anyways, let's get started with this list. So, we have the Big Lots store in Anastasia, Alabama, the Big Lots store in Auburn, Alabama, the Big Lots store in Dothan, Alabama, the Big Lots store in Florence, Alabama, the Big Lots store in Forley, Alabama, the Big Lots store in Hoover, Alabama, the Big Lots store in Montgomery, Alabama, the Big Lots store in Rainbow City, Alabama, the Big Lots store in Benton, Arkansas, the Big Lots store in Conway, Arkansas, the Big Lots store in Fort Smith, Arkansas, the Big Lots store in Harrison, Arkansas, the Big Lots store in Hot Springs National Park, Arkansas, the Big Lots store in Jonesboro, Arkansas, the Big Lots store in Mountain Home, Arkansas, the Big Lots store in Paragould, Arkansas, and the Big Lots store in Searcy, Arkansas. The Big Lots store in Bullhead City, Arizona, the Big Lots store in Casa Grande, Arizona, the Big Lots store in Glendale, Arizona, the Big Lots store in Kingman, Arizona, the Big Lots store in Phoenix, Arizona, the Big Lots store in Show Low, Arizona, the Big Lots store in Sierra Vista, Arizona, and the Big Lots store in Yuma, Arizona. The Big Lots store in Apple Valley, California, the Big Lots store in Bakersfield, California, the Big Lots store in Buena Park, California, the Big Lots store in Clovis, California, the Big Lots store in La Canada, Flint Ridge, California, the Big Lots store in Los Angeles, California, the Big Lots store in Modesto, California, the Big Lots store in Marietta, California, the Big Lots store in North Ridge, California, the Big Lots store in Port Hume, California, the Big Lots store in Redding, California, the Big Lots store in Redondo Beach, California, the Big Lots store in Rialto, California, the Big Lots store in Tulare, California, the Big Lots store in Aurora, Colorado, the Big Lots store in Brighton, Colorado, the Big Lots store in Lakewood, Colorado, and the Big Lots store in Pueblo, Colorado. Then we have the Big Lots store in Bristol, Connecticut, the Big Lots store in Derby, Connecticut, the Big Lots store in East Hartford, Connecticut, the Big Lots store in Middleton, Connecticut, the Big Lots store in North Haven, Connecticut, and the Big Lots store in Wallingford, Connecticut. The Big Lots store in Newcastle, Delaware, and the Big Lots store in Wilmington, Delaware. The Big Lots store in Apopka, Florida, the Big Lots store in Evan Park, Florida, the Big Lots store in Brenton, Florida, the Big Lots store in Callaway, Florida, the Big Lots store in Clearwater, Florida, the Big Lots store in Coca, Florida, the Big Lots store in Coral Springs, Florida, the Big Lots store in Crestview, Florida, the Big Lots store in Dade City, Florida, the Big Lots store in DeLand, Florida, the Big Lots store in Fort Lauderdale, Florida, the Big Lots store in Fort Myers, Florida, the Big Lots store in Fort Pierce, Florida, the Big Lots store in Fort Walton Beach, Florida, the Big Lots store in Gainesville, Florida, the Big Lots store in Green Crest, Florida, the Big Lots store in Hanese City, Florida, two Big Lots stores in Jacksonville, Florida, the Big Lots store in Jensen Beach, Florida, the Big Lots store in Kissimmee, Florida, the Big Lots store in Lake City, Florida, the Big Lots store in Lakeland, Florida, total of two, the Big Lots store in Lando Lakes, Florida, the Big Lots store in Leesburg, Florida, the Big Lots store in Miami, Florida, the Big Lots store in Newport Richey, Florida, the Big Lots store in New Smyrna Beach, Florida, the Big Lots store also Ocala, Florida, the Big Lots store in Orange City, Florida, the Big Lots store in Orlando, Florida, the Big Lots store in Palatica, Florida, the Big Lots store in Panama City, Florida, the Big Lots store in Pembroke Pines, Florida, the Big Lots store in Pensacola, Florida, the Big Lots store in Plant City, Florida, the Big Lots store in Port Charlotte, Florida, the Big Lots store in Port Orange, Florida, the Big Lots store in St. Petersburg, Florida, the Big Lots store in Sarasota, Florida, the Big Lots store in Tampa, Florida, the Big Lots store in Venice, Florida, and the Big Lots store in Zephyrhills, Florida. The Big Lots store in Atlanta, Georgia, the Big Lots store in Cartersville, Georgia, the Big Lots store in Columbus, Georgia, the Big Lots store in Douglasville, Georgia, the Big Lots store in Gainesville, Georgia, the Big Lots store in Griffin, Georgia, and the Big Lots store in Hinesville, Georgia. The Big Lots store in Kennesaw, Georgia, the Big Lots store in Monroe, Georgia, the Big Lots store in Newman, Georgia, and the Big Lots store in Warner Robins, Georgia. The Big Lots store in Burlington, Iowa, the Big Lots store in Corriedale, Allen, Idaho, the Big Lots store in Idaho Falls, Idaho, the Big Lots store in Lewiston, Idaho, the Big Lots store in Meriden, Idaho, the Big Lots store in Altaloon, Illinois, the Big Lots store in Bornabazes, Illinois, the Big Lots store in Danville, Illinois, the Big Lots store in East Peoria, Illinois, the Big Lots store in Franklin Park, Illinois, the Big Lots store in Galesburg, Illinois, the Big Lots store in Mattoon, Illinois, the Big Lots store in Maloon, Illinois, the Big Lots store in Mount Vernon, Illinois, the Big Lots store in Peoria, Illinois, the Big Lots store in Peru, Illinois, the Big Lots store in Quincy, Illinois, two Big Lots stores in Springfield, Illinois, and the Big Lots store in Wooddale, Illinois. Then we have the Big Lots store in Anderson, Indiana, the Big Lots store in Aurora, Indiana, the Big Lots store in Bloomington, Indiana, the Big Lots store in Clarksville, Indiana, the Big Lots store in Fort Wayne, Indiana, the Big Lots store in Franklin, Indiana, the Big Lots store in Greenville, Indiana, the Big Lots store in Indianapolis, Indiana, the Big Lots store in Lafayette, Indiana, the Big Lots store in Logansport, Indiana, the Big Lots store in Maroon, Indiana, the Big Lots store in Michigan City, Indiana, the Big Lots store in Mishawaka, Indiana, the Big Lots store in New Albany, Indiana, the Big Lots store in Portage, Indiana, the Big Lots store in Shreeville, Indiana, the Big Lots store in Shelbyville, Indiana, the Big Lots store in South Bend, Indiana, the Big Lots store in Speedway, Indiana, the Big Lots store in Chilhowee, Indiana, the Big Lots store in Pittsburgh, Kansas, the Big Lots store in Shawnee, Kansas, and the Big Lots store in Topeka, Kansas. Then we have the Big Lots store in Bowling Green, Kentucky, the Big Lots store in Corbin, Kentucky, the Big Lots store in Frankfort, Kentucky. We have the Big Lots store in Georgetown, Kentucky, two Big Lots store in Louisville, Kentucky, the Big Lots store in Mayfield, Kentucky, the Big Lots store in Owensboro, Kentucky, the Big Lots store in Paducah, Kentucky, the Big Lots store in Prestonsburg, Kentucky, the Big Lots store in Richmond, Kentucky, the Big Lots store in Chomolete, Louisiana, the Big Lots store in Covington, Louisiana, the Big Lots store in Gonzales, Louisiana, the Big Lots store in LaPlace, Louisiana, the Big Lots store in Lake Charles, Louisiana, the Big Lots store in Sedille, Louisiana, the Big Lots store in Thabadox, Louisiana, and the Big Lots store in West Monroe, Louisiana. Then we have the Big Lots store in Attleboro, Massachusetts, the Big Lots store in Auburn, Massachusetts, the Big Lots store in Billisseria, Massachusetts, the Big Lots store in Fairhaven, Massachusetts, the Big Lots store in Fitchburg, Massachusetts, the Big Lots store in Franklin, Massachusetts, the Big Lots store in Garden, Massachusetts, the Big Lots store in Lynn, Massachusetts, the Big Lots store in Metuchen, Massachusetts, the Big Lots store in Milford, Massachusetts, the Big Lots store in Pittsfield, Massachusetts, the Big Lots store in Plymouth, Massachusetts, the Big Lots store in Raymond, Massachusetts, Big Lots store in Revere, Massachusetts, the Big Lots store in Springfield, Massachusetts, the Big Lots store in Swanesa, Massachusetts, and the Big Lots store in Webster, Massachusetts. Then we have the Big Lots store in Chester, Maryland, the Big Lots store in Dundalk, Maryland, the Big Lots store in Easton, Maryland, the Big Lots store in Edgewood, Maryland, the Big Lots store in Elkin, Maryland, the Big Lots store in Fredericksburg, Maryland, the Big Lots store in Frostburg, Maryland, the Big Lots store in Glen Burnie, Maryland, the Big Lots store in Hagerstown, Maryland, the Big Lots store in Middle River, Maryland, the Big Lots store in Montgomery Village, Maryland, the Big Lots store in Parkville, Maryland, the Big Lots store in Prince Frederick, Maryland, the Big Lots store in Rising Sun, Maryland, the Big Lots store in Salisbury, Maryland, the Big Lots store in Waldorf, Maryland, and the Big Lots store in Westminster, Maryland. Then we have the Big Lots store in Auburn, Maine, the Big Lots store in Augusta, Maine, the Big Lots store in Brunswick, Maine, and the Big Lots store in Farmington, Maine. Then we have the Big Lots store in Appalena, Michigan, the Big Lots store in Battle Creek, Michigan, the Big Lots store in Bay City, Michigan, the Big Lots store in Chesterfield, Michigan, the Big Lots store in Dearborn, Michigan, the Big Lots store in East Point, Michigan, the Big Lots store, two of them in Grand Rapids, Michigan, the Big Lots store in Monroe, Michigan, the Big Lots store in Musking, Michigan, the Big Lots store in Niles, Michigan, the Big Lots store in Sault Ste. Marie, Michigan, the Big Lots store in Southfield, Michigan, the Big Lots store in Southgate, Michigan, the Big Lots store in Sterling Heights, Michigan, and the Big Lots store in Westland, Michigan. In Minnesota, we have the Big Lots store in Blaine, Minnesota. In Missouri, we have the Big Lots store in Blue Springs, Missouri, the Big Lots store in Fenton, Missouri, the Big Lots store in Joplin, Missouri, the Big Lots store in Lebanon, Missouri, the Big Lots store in Rolla, Missouri, the Big Lots store in Sedalina, Missouri, two Big Lots stores in Springfield, Missouri, the Big Lots store in Washington, Missouri, the Big Lots store in Webster Groves, Missouri, and the Big Lots store in West Plains, Missouri. In the state of Mississippi, we have the Big Lots store in D'Iberville, Mississippi, the Big Lots store in Gulfport, Mississippi, and the Big Lots store in Pascagoula, Mississippi. In the state of Montana, we have the Big Lots store in Billings, Montana. In the state of North Carolina, we have the Big Lots store in Ardene, North Carolina, and two Big Lots stores in Winston-Salem, North Carolina. In the state of North Dakota, we have the Big Lots store in Bismarck, North Dakota. In the state of Nebraska, we have the Big Lots store in Omaha, Nebraska. In the state of New Hampshire, we have the Big Lots store in Belmont, New Hampshire, the Big Lots store in Derry, New Hampshire, the Big Lots store in Goffstown, New Hampshire, and the Big Lots store in Nashua, New Hampshire, and also Big Lots in Belmont, New Hampshire. In my home state of New Jersey, we have the Big Lots store in Barnegat, New Jersey, the Big Lots store in Beverly, New Jersey, the Big Lots store in Brick, New Jersey, the Big Lots store in Cape May, New Jersey, the Big Lots store at Cape May Courthouse, New Jersey, Big Lots store in Clifton, New Jersey, which is my local one, which I have to visit, the Big Lots store in Dover, New Jersey, the Big Lots store in Hamilton, New Jersey, the Big Lots store in Lumberton, New Jersey, the Big Lots store in Middletown, New Jersey, the Big Lots store in Millville, New Jersey, the Big Lots store in Sicklerville, New Jersey, the Big Lots store in Somers Point, New Jersey, the Big Lots store in South Plainfield, New Jersey, the Big Lots store in Toms River, New Jersey, and finally the Big Lots store in West Deptford, New Jersey. In the state of New Mexico, we have the Big Lots store in Albuquerque, New Mexico, two Big Lots stores in Albuquerque, New Mexico, the Big Lots store in Carlsbad, New Mexico, the Big Lots store in Clovis, New Mexico, the Big Lots store in Farmington, New Mexico, the Big Lots store in Gallup, New Mexico, the Big Lots store in Habas, New Mexico, the Big Lots store in Las Cruces, New Mexico, the Big Lots store in Rio Rancho, New Mexico, the Big Lots store in Roswell, New Mexico, and the Big Lots store in Santa Fe, New Mexico. In the state of Nevada, we have the Big Lots store in Carson City, Nevada, the Big Lots store in Las Vegas, Nevada, and the Big Lots store in Sparks, Nevada. In the state of New York, we have the Big Lots store in Amsterdam, New York, the Big Lots store in Auburn, New York, the Big Lots store in Brockport, New York, the Big Lots store in Chaffee, New York, the Big Lots store in Clifton Park, New York, the Big Lots store in Collins, New York, the Big Lots store in Copiague, New York, the Big Lots store in Cortland, New York, the Big Lots store in Dansville, New York, the Big Lots store in DeFew, New York, the Big Lots store in Dunkirk, New York, the Big Lots store in East Rochester, New York, the Big Lots store in El Maria, New York, the Big Lots store in Granville, New York, the Big Lots store in Greenwich, New York, the Big Lots store in Hamburg, New York, the Big Lots store in Hamilton, New York, the Big Lots store in Hicksville, New York, the Big Lots store in Holbrook, New York, the Big Lots store in Jamestown, New York, the Big Lots store in Kingston, New York, the Big Lots store in Liverpool, New York, the Big Lots store in Lockport, New York, the Big Lots store in Meline, New York, the Big Lots store in Messenia, New York, the Big Lots store in Mannydale, New York, the Big Lots store in Newburgh, New York, the Big Lots store in Niagara Falls, New York, the Big Lots store in Olean, New York, the Big Lots store in Ondia, New York, the Big Lots store in Ontario, New York, the Big Lots store in Oswego, New York, the Big Lots store in Painted Post, New York, the Big Lots store in Palmatine Bridge, New York, the Big Lots store in Potsdam, New York, the Big Lots store in Pulaski, New York, the Big Lots store, two of them in Rochester, New York, three. Big Lots store in Rome, New York, Big Lots store in Sarageese, New York, the Big Lots store in Tonawanda, New York, the Big Lots store in Utica, New York, the Big Lots store in Vestal, New York, the Big Lots store in Winnipeg Falls, New York, the Big Lots store in Watertown, New York, the Big Lots store in West Babylon, New York, and the Big Lots store in West Sena, New York. In the state of Ohio, we have the Big Lots store in Ashtabula, Ohio, the Big Lots store in Bowling Green, Ohio, the Big Lots store in Brunswick, Ohio, the Big Lots store in Sheridan, Ohio, the Big Lots store in Circleville, Ohio, the Big Lots store in Cleveland, Ohio, the Big Lots store in Columbus, Ohio, the Big Lots store in Coshocton, Ohio, the Big Lots store in Delaware, Ohio, the Big Lots store in Dublin, Ohio, the Big Lots store in East Liverpool, Ohio, the Big Lots store in Findlay, Ohio, the Big Lots store in Heath, Ohio, the Big Lots store in Holland, Ohio, the Big Lots store in Hubbard Heights, Ohio, the Big Lots store in Lima, Ohio, the Big Lots store in Marysville, Ohio, the Big Lots store in Pequea, Ohio, the Big Lots store in Portsmouth, Ohio, the Big Lots store in Tiffin, Ohio, the Big Lots store in Tortwood, Ohio, the Big Lots store in Willenbury, Ohio, and the Big Lots store in Youngstown, Ohio. In the state of Oklahoma, we have the Big Lots store in Adia, Oklahoma, the Big Lots store in Ardmore, Oklahoma, the Big Lots store in Bartlesville, Oklahoma, the Big Lots store in Broken Arrow, Oklahoma, the Big Lots store in Durant, Oklahoma, the Big Lots store in Edmond, Oklahoma, Big Lots store in Midwest City, Oklahoma, the Big Lots store in Muskie, Oklahoma, the Big Lots store in Norman, Oklahoma, the Big Lots store in Oklahoma City, Oklahoma, and the Big Lots store in Osawasso, Oklahoma. Additionally, we have the Big Lots store in Tulsa, Oklahoma, and the Big Lots store in Yukon, Oklahoma. A lot of Big Lots stores, by the way. Then we have the Big Lots store in Bend, Oregon, home of the last blockbuster in the United States of America and the world. The Big Lots store in Hermiston, Oregon. The Big Lots store in Klamath Falls, Oregon. The Big Lots store in Medford, Oregon. The Big Lots store in Roseburg, Oregon. The Big Lots store in Allentown, Pennsylvania. The Big Lots store in Altalena, Pennsylvania. The Big Lots store in Belle Vernon, Pennsylvania. The Big Lots store in Bardford, Pennsylvania, the Big Lots store in Bridgeville, Pennsylvania, the Big Lots store in Burnham, Pennsylvania, the Big Lots store in East Stroudsburg, Pennsylvania, the Big Lots store in Hermitage, Pennsylvania, the Big Lots store in Hummelstown, Pennsylvania, the Big Lots store in Leechburg, Pennsylvania, the Big Lots store in Lucerne, Pennsylvania, the Big Lots store in Manusee, Pennsylvania, the Big Lots store in North Versailles, Pennsylvania, the Big Lots store in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, the Big Lots store in Reading, Pennsylvania, the Big Lots store in Shippensburg, Pennsylvania, the Big Lots store in Surreyton, Pennsylvania, the Big Lots store in State College, Pennsylvania, the Big Lots store in West Hazelton, Pennsylvania, the Big Lots store in West Mifflin, Pennsylvania, the Big Lots store in Whitehall, Pennsylvania, the Big Lots store in Warwick, Rhode Island, the Big Lots store in Anderson, South Carolina, the Big Lots store in Camden, South Carolina, the Big Lots store in Gaffey, South Carolina, the Big Lots store in Greenville, South Carolina, the Big Lots store in Garous, South Carolina, and two Big Lots stores in Spartanburg, South Carolina. In the state of Tennessee, we have the Big Lots store in Bristol, Tennessee, the Big Lots store in Elizabeth, Tennessee, the Big Lots store in Hermitage, Tennessee, the Big Lots store in Knoxville, Tennessee, the Big Lots store in Milton, Tennessee, and the Big Lots store in Springfield, Tennessee. In Texas, it's going to be a lot, so brace yourselves. So we have the Big Lots store in Abilene, Texas, the Big Lots store in Murillo, Texas, two Big Lots stores in Arlington, Texas, two Big Lots stores in Austin, Texas, Big Lots stores in Bedford, Texas, Big Lots store in Brownsville, Texas, Big Lots store in Brownwood, Texas, the Big Lots store in Bersaline, Texas, the Big Lots store in Carlton, Texas, the Big Lots store in Cedar Park, Texas, the Big Lots store in Submarine, Texas, the Big Lots store in Conroe, Texas, the Big Lots store in Converse, Texas, the Big Lots store in Corpus Christi, Texas, the Big Lots store in Corsicana, Texas, the Big Lots store in Dallas, Texas, the Big Lots store in DeSoto, Texas, the Big Lots store in Edinburgh, Texas, a total of 4 Big Lots stores in El Paso, Texas, the Big Lots store in Farmers Branch, Texas, 2 Big Lots stores in Fort Worth, Texas, the Big Lots store in Granbury, Texas, the Big Lots store in Greenville, Texas, the Big Lots store in Harlington, Texas, total of 3 Big Lots stores in Houston, Texas, the Big Lots store in Humble, Texas, the Big Lots store in Irving, Texas, the Big Lots store in Keller, Texas, the Big Lots store in Caryville, Texas, the Big Lots store in Killeen, Texas, the Big Lots store in Lake Jackson, Texas, the Big Lots store in Lake Worth, Texas, 2 Big Lots stores in Laredo, Texas, the Big Lots store in Louisville, Texas, the Big Lots store in Longview, Texas, 2 Big Lots stores in Lubbock, Texas, the Big Lots store in Lufkin, Texas, the Big Lots store in Marshall, Texas, the Big Lots store in McKinley, Texas, the Big Lots store in Mesquite, Texas, the Big Lots store in Mount Pleasant, Texas, the Big Lots store in New Bernal Fells, Texas, the Big Lots store in Pasadena, Texas, the Big Lots store in Porter, Texas, the Big Lots store in Rockwell, Texas, the Big Lots store in Rolette, Texas, a total of, that looks to be 5 Big Lots stores in San Antonio, Texas, the Big Lots stores in Sherman, Texas, the Big Lots store in Sugar Land, Texas, the Big Lots stores in the Big Lots store in Texarkana, Texas, and the Big Lots store in Tyler, Texas. Then we have the Big Lots store in Victoria, Texas, the Big Lots store in Waco, Texas, the Big Lots store in Wasahine, Texas, the Big Lots store in Weatherford, Texas, the Big Lots store in Webbers, Texas, the Big Lots store in West Ellicott, Texas, and the Big Lots store in Ithaca Falls, Texas. In the state of Utah, we have the Big Lots store in South Odine, Utah. In the state of Virginia, we have the Big Lots stores in Culpeper, Texas, Culpeper, Virginia, the Big Lots store in Danville, Virginia, the Big Lots store in Galex, Virginia, the Big Lots store in Gulster, Virginia, the Big Lots store in Harrisonburg, Virginia, the Big Lots store in Herricino, Virginia, the Big Lots store in Richmond, Virginia, the Big Lots store in Suffolk, Virginia, the Big Lots store in Virginia Beach, Virginia. In the state of Vermont, we have the Big Lots store in Essex Junction, Vermont, and the Big Lots store in Morrisville, Vermont. In the state of Washington, we have the Big Lots store in Kennewick, Washington, the Big Lots store in Longview, Washington, the Big Lots store in Moses Lake, Washington, and the Big Lots store in Ucama, Washington. In the state of Wisconsin, we have the Big Lots store in Green Bay, Wisconsin, and the Big Lots store in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. In the state of West Virginia, we have the Big Lots store in Moundsville, West Virginia, and the Big Lots store in Veneta, West Virginia. And finally, in the state of Wyoming, we have the Big Lots store in Casper, Wyoming. And so, guys, that is all of the Big Lots stores that are unfortunately going to be closing and liquidating. Again, if I did not list a store that was on this list, that means your Big Lots store was acquired by the other company, and you are expected to keep a job. Again, this is the new Big Lots store closing list as of Wednesday, January 15th, 2025. So again, this link will be located in the description below. I want to sincerely thank you guys for watching. I know that this was a long video, but I tried to cover every location as possible. And I wish nothing but the best for the people that will be losing their job at these stores in the next couple of weeks. So thank you guys for watching, and that will be it.